The Senate has one extremely important item on our agenda: to keep the lights on. In other words, to pass a government funding bill. We're just 3 days from the end of the fiscal year, and the Democrat-controlled Senate has yet to pass a single appropriations bill. No funding for our military, no funding for veteran services, no funding for border security, nothing. Now, this deadline does not sneak up out of nowhere. It arrives on the same day every year. Yet here we are 3 days before the funding expires, and not a single appropriations bill has been voted on. Now, the Majority Leader conceded a long time ago that the regular appropriation bills would be punted to a later date, and we would pass a short-term funding bill to bridge the gap. As a general rule, I'm not a fan of short-term funding bills. They don't provide the stability or predictability we need to plan for the future. That's especially true for America's military, which is operating in a dynamic threat environment with countless unknowns. In order to plan for and prepare for the future, government agencies need a predictable budget, and stopgap bills simply don't cut it. As though this last-minute funding gambit isn't dramatic enough, the Majority Leader has raised the stakes even higher. He's not putting a clean funding bill on the floor, he's weighing it down with partisan freight. This is part of a political horse trade that happened a couple of months ago. In order to get the senior senator from West Virginia to vote for his reckless tax and spending bill, the Majority Leader promised to attach permitting reform to the government funding bill. Forget the fact that Senator Manchin's permitting bill was nowhere near complete. The Majority Leader blindly agreed to tack it on to must-pass legislation. Senator Manchin, the senior senator from West Virginia, finally released his bill last week, and it became clear why he was so desperate to attach it to a must-pass continuing resolution. That's because the bill doesn't come even close to delivering the real common-sense changes that were promised. The provisions meant to speed up the approval process for new projects lack teeth, making them unlikely to produce any real progress. The bill doesn't touch the environmental reviews, which cause a lot of delays to happen in the first place. On top of that, it's a power grab by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, granting them unprecedented authority to force electric transmission lines on states. Under the current law, states have the authority to decide whether or not to grant transmission lines to run through their states. It's part of something called state sovereignty, federalism. Under this bill, that would change, though. The unelected leaders at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission could override a state's objection to new project transmitting lines transmitting renewable energy. In short, if a state like Illinois needs a new interstate transmission line to help meet its clean energy mandates, its neighbors will have no choice but to oblige. It will be forced on them. Folks in Indiana or Ohio or any other state could be forced to help subsidize the cost of Illinois' renewable energy. This is a far cry from the kind of common sense permitting reform that Senator Manchin has been talking about. This bill falls short in almost every regard, which is why we've seen such broad bipartisan opposition. There aren't many energy bills where my vote aligns with that of the junior senator from Vermont, Senator Sanders, but this is one of them. Despite the strong opposition to Senator Manchin's bill, the Majority Leader is still moving forward with a procedural vote this evening, and he knows it will fail. It will not succeed. Then Senator Schumer, the Majority Leader, will have a choice: pass a clean funding bill to keep the lights on, to keep government open, or shut down the government over their reckless tax and spending spree deal cut behind closed doors last summer. If you'll remember, a couple months ago, at the same time he professed publicly and privately that the disastrous radical tax and spending spree bill was dead, the senior senator from West Virginia was negotiating a sweetheart deal in secret, unbeknownst to Republicans and, by the way, unbeknownst to all Democrats other than the majority leader. Fast forward to today, when that deal falls apart this evening, he'll need to abandon his secret deal with Senator Schumer. For our country's sake, I hope the majority leader and Senator Manchin won't shut down the government. With so much economic uncertainty already, the last thing we need is a government shutdown. Madam President, on another matter, this is the last week the House of Representatives will be in session until after the election. Once the chamber gavels out at the end of the week, members will go home and they won't return until November the 14th. That doesn't leave a lot of time to accomplish the work of the American people. In fact, after this week, the House is scheduled to only be in session for 4 more weeks this year. As my colleagues here in the Senate know, the House has a lot to do and not a lot of time to do it. Since the start of the Congress, the Senate has passed a long list of bipartisan bills that are still awaiting action in the House. Many of these bills passed this chamber unanimously and will provide critical support for our communities. Here's just one example. Last year, Senator Padilla, the junior senator from California, and I introduced a bill to support infrastructure and disaster relief projects all across the country. Our bill would open up billions of dollars for states and local governments to put toward their most critical projects without adding a penny to the deficit. That's because the money that would be freed up has already been appropriated for COVID-19 relief, but is in excess of what the states and local governments need for that purpose. Our bill would take the handcuffs off and allow them to spend that money if they want. They're not required to do so, but if they want, they can spend up to 1/3 of their excess funds on an infrastructure or disaster relief. And it doesn't add another penny to the deficit. Over the last year and a half, I've heard from leaders all across my state in Texas who are frustrated about the handcuffs that have been put on them when it comes to spending the money that Congress had appropriated for COVID-19 relief. Senator Padilla told me he's hearing the same thing from leaders in California. So we got to work. We spoke with folks in our states as well as our Senate colleagues and administration officials, and we came up with legislation that was simple but very effective in providing that sort of flexibility that our local communities and our states have asked for. In some places that means pandemic-related expenses, which will take a priority, but our legislation won't interfere with any plans to spend that money on already approved pandemic expenses. But it will give the states and localities without that need the option to invest those funds in infrastructure projects. And usually what happens here in Washington is the United States Congress appropriates money, and it literally takes a couple of years to get the money from D.C. down to places like Austin, Texas, where the Texas legislatures can then figure out how to disperse those funds. But now we know they already have the money in their hands, but they simply can't use it because of the restrictions placed on those funds. Senator Padilla's and my bill would remove those restrictions for important purposes like infrastructure and like disaster relief. Things like widening highways, constructing bridges, extending railways, expanding broadband. Our bill includes a long list of qualifying expenses. It also will allow leaders to put their funding toward disaster relief, which is a major need in areas all across the country. Places like Texas and Kentucky, for example, have experienced devastating flooding in the last few months. Puerto Rico, we know, has just been hit by a terrible hurricane and is still trying to restore power. Florida is bracing for impact of Hurricane Ian as it makes its way to the Gulf Coast. And California continues to battle destructive wildfires. Our bill would allow leaders to open up disaster relief funds virtually instantly as soon as the president signs the bill into law. They already have the funding in hand. They won't have to wait for a federal disaster declaration or emergency funding from Congress. They could write the check themselves and mobilize resources instantaneously. It's no surprise this bill passed the Senate 100-0. It was unanimous. These are the sort of common sense things that will benefit communities all across the United States. This bill will open up tens of millions of dollars for infrastructure projects in communities all across the country, and it will support critical disaster relief efforts as well. And it will empower state and local leaders to make the best decisions for their communities. And it will ensure that this funding can deliver on its intended purpose, which is to alleviate the financial burden imposed by the pandemic on our states and local governments. I hope Speaker Pelosi will bring up and pass this bill as quickly as possible. It would help her state of California, but more importantly, would help the entire country. But this is just one of many bipartisan bills that's currently sitting in the House. Since the start of Congress, the Senate's unanimously approved bills that I've introduced to prevent and identify child sexual abuse, to provide incarcerated individuals with access to treatment for their substance use disorder, to facilitate more cross-border trade with our neighbors to the north and the south, to support programs that help individuals experiencing mental health crises, to provide tax relief to survivors of human trafficking, to equip law enforcement officers with the tools they need in order to help people in crisis. It would be a shame if the Speaker declined to bring these bills up and pass them, and I'm sure they'd pass by overwhelming votes in the United States House of Representatives, as they did here in the Senate. But the House is only scheduled to be in session a few more weeks this Congress. It's time to get moving on these common sense, non-controversial, nonpartisan bills. Otherwise, we'll have to start back at square one next year. Madam President, I yield the floor.